to a fractured culture, a softening of our defenses against sensitivity, and a thriving life to neurodivergent women and men everywhere. Part 2. Outer Frames. Chapter 3. Autism, Synesthesia, and ADHD. Cece Hart grew up in California's Central Valley with a mother who noticed her strong body awareness as a child. Hart's mother, a nurse, encouraged her daughter to go into physical therapy in order to use her hands, and eventually Hart became a massage therapist. A client once mentioned synesthesia to her, and a kind of relief and shock hit her all at once. She finally had a word to describe her experience of feeling what others feel, seeing colors when reading books, and more. She didn't learn she had synesthesia until she was in her early 40s. Hart was a gifted child who began reading at age 2.5, and she had always seen letters as colors and symbols. A mirror touch synesthete as well. She would feel others' pain, both physical and emotional. I would see another child scrape, and I would feel a shock of electricity go up and down my body. It never occurred to me to say anything because this was just my experience of normal. I didn't know that other people didn't experience that.
She was able to verbalize
Hart's sensory sensitivities are varied, and she wonders whether she might be classified on the autism spectrum as well. She was recently diagnosed with ADHD, something she had suspected and that was suggested to her after finally finding a psychiatrist who took the necessary time to analyze and interpret the nuances of her symptom presentation beyond stereotypical ideas. For many people, autism, ADHD, and synesthesia occur together. She describes her world as too much or too loud. Now, as an adult, Hart walks into a room and is a magnet for others, with her long red hair and flowing colorful outfits. When I met her one evening and she hugged me close, I felt that same shock of electricity she describes. Her warmth is palpable. But when Hart was an infant, her mother took her to a pediatrician because she thought something was wrong when she didn't engage with others like her sister did. These are themes that many women shared with me over the course of my writing this book. Being bright, having multiple sensitivities or diagnoses, and having parents who fear that something is very wrong. For those of us like Hart, it takes time for our nervous systems to become calibrated to the outside world and the staccato rhythms that feel like assaults. After a series of trials and errors, figuring out what type of work matches our skills and needs, or what kind of people are compatible with us, we finally come out of our shells.
I like her voice.
Autism. A person with so-called classic autism is what many doctors and laypeople describe as socially awkward, in their own world, and lacking empathy and normal or appropriate social interaction. This pathologizing language describes a person in terms of individual norms and expectations. We don't often stop to think about what is happening in society on a larger scale that would generate such a description or make that person sound so bad. Only when we step back and examine the behaviors from a non-stigmatized perspective can we realize that people described this way aren't bad. They are merely different when measured with an established, and some might say arbitrary, barometer. In fact, many people in the autistic community like to flip the script and point out how awful neurotypical culture and expectations are. Think small talk, social niceties, herd mentality, compliance, and other unpleasant or taxing behaviors that are deemed normal. While figures like the professor and author Temple Grandin have brought attention to the gifts of autism, our culture as a whole remains steeped in images and definitions that see this kind of neurological makeup as a defect. More and more, we are appreciating the fact that the range of autistic experience is vast, necessitating the use of the label spectrum. and autistic advocates are now speaking out and challenging pervasive false notions. This is most apparent on Twitter, where artistic culture thrives and artistic individuals all over the world share personal stories and insights on their own terms and in their own voices. "Nothing about us without us" is a popular slogan. Instead of being studied from the outside, autistic people are giving voice to their experiences on their own terms. Twitter is a perfect vehicle for this, where no stone is left unturned and no question is too cumbersome. Why is the rate of suicidal ideation higher among the autistic population? Why do autistic individuals prefer that the month of April be called Autism Acceptance Month rather than Autism Awareness Month? The idea that autistic people lack empathy, for example, is often countered on Twitter, with people sharing how, in fact, it's their overabundance of empathy that causes them to shut down emotionally and retreat. There's no lack of empathy, but too much of it. How's that for reframing? What I heard in research, conducting interviews, and reporting on the autistic experience is that sensitivity features prominently in autism and is both a strength and a challenge. In the case of autistic women, many of whom have been sensitive their entire lives, but not known they were on the autism spectrum, the question of utilizing and managing sensitivity is tricky because many have been told or taught that something is wrong with them. As a result, many have experienced shame, depression, and severe anxiety. Author Samantha Kraft, who is autistic
like
and
how
is
this
often a
woman
go-to resource for
describes
women
the
wondering whether they are
symptoms
also
of
autistic,
and signs
has
of
compiled an
autism.
unofficial list that she says is a springboard for discussion and more awareness into the female experience of
It's
autism.
not
This can be
something's
helpful
wrong.
because the authors of the DSM are often
She's getting
changing
ready
its
to
scope, and many doctors and therapists are at a loss regarding how to diagnose. Here are some abbreviated items from her list regarding autism: Asperger's. Seeing things at multiple levels, including her own thinking processes. Escaping in thought or action to survive overwhelming emotions and senses. Continually analyzing existence, the meaning of life, and everything.
'Cause the way she
Escaping through
describes it, I
fixations,
relate to it.
obsessions, and over-interest in subjects through imagination, fantasy, daydreaming, and mental processing through the rhythm of words.
There was that
Often getting
echologist
lost in her own thoughts
where
and
you're, like,
checking
saying one
out.
word.
Blank stare. Imitating people on television or in movies.
This echologist.
Experiencing trouble with lying. Escaping through relationships, imagined or real. Finding it difficult to understand some human characteristics,
See, like
such as
that's
manipulation,
deviation
disloyalty,
from social
vindictive
norms.
behavior,
It's just
and
like,
retaliation.
just instead of that, and using
Escaping into
social
other
or
rooms at
normal and
parties.
deviation, you say finding it difficult
Experiencing
to
feelings of
understand
confusion and being
social
overwhelmed.
things.
Being unable to relax or rest without having many thoughts.
You're not being seen as one.
Experiencing feelings of being misplaced and or from another planet.
Or a robot.
Feeling extreme relief when she doesn't have to go anywhere, talk to anyone, answer calls,
Really
or leave the
relate to
house, but at the same time harboring guilt for hibernating and not doing what everyone else is doing. Feeling isolated. Perceiving visitors at the home as a threat. This can even be a familiar family member. Knowing logically that visitors are not a threat, but still feeling anxious. Obsessing about the potentiality of a relationship with someone, particularly a love interest or new friendship.
That one.
Dreading upcoming
Obsessing
events and
about a new
appointments.
relationship with someone.
Being confused by the rules of accurate eye contact, tone of voice, proximity of body, body stance, and posture in conversation. Feeling anxiety knowing she has to leave the house and feeling overwhelmed and exhausted by the steps involved. becoming exhausted by conversations, preparing mentally for outings, excursions, meetings, and appointments,
See, all
often
that stuff I
days
didn't
before a
know
scheduled
was
event.
abnormal.
Continually questioning the actions and behaviors of herself and others. Continually questioning next steps and movements. Training herself in social interactions through reading and studying other people.
See, that's what I do through
Feeling
social
as if
media.
she is on stage being watched and, or having a sense of always needing to act out the right steps. Visualizing and practicing how to act around others. Having huge compassion for suffering, sometimes for inanimate objects. Practicing, rehearsing what to say to another person before entering a
I wouldn't
room.
say that I have that per se, but if something has
Being
sentimental
sensitive to
value, I
substances,
do like
environmental toxins,
mourn, like
foods,
when
alcohol,
Kendall
medication, hormones,
accidentally
etc.
broke Kanga's eye, lost
Having
Kanga's eye.
difficulty filtering out background noise when talking to others. Questioning her purpose in life and how to be a better person. Having a continuous inner dialogue about what to say and how to act in social situations. Seeking to understand personal abilities, skills, and gifts. Feeling great peace of mind when she knows she can stay at home all day. Feeling trapped between wanting to be herself and wanting to fit in. Requiring a large amount of downtime or alone time. Imitating others without realizing it.
That is what I didn't realize I did.
Feeling
until after my
guilty after
autism
spending a lot of
diagnosis,
time on a special interest.
borrow from people that
Rejecting and or questioning social norms.
first time I really saw it
Disliking
was Chewy.
being in a crowded mall, gym, or theater.
Copied it, but even that was before my diagnosis.
Having a hard time
It
feeling
bothered
good
me.
about herself.
Did not knowing why.
Being sensitive to sounds, textures, temperatures, and or smells when trying to sleep. Not understanding jokes. Adjusting
I don't
bed
even like the
clothes,
way she
bedding,
says
and
not
or
understanding
environment
jokes,
in an
though. I
attempt
get
to find
jokes
comfort.
when enough context is provided.
Remembering details about someone's
I guess
life
that's a
or
joke, but
details generally.
Exactly it. You require more.
Longing to be seen, heard,
Yes,
and
yeah.
understood.
But I don't see how anybody could
Relieving
get a joke
anxiety
about
by writing or being creative.
if they don't know about the subject.
It's not like
Questioning whether she is normal.
heard a joke and like other people
Having certain feelings or emotions
I just
toward
figured
words
they
and
understood
or
it,
numbers.
like more enough to
At times adapting her view of life or actions
I
on the
see that as
basis
a
of
lack
others'
of
opinions or words. Experiencing
knowledge.
simple tasks is causing extreme
But
hardship.
like, is it more to it? To me, it's like if you
Viewing
joke
many
about,
things as an extension of herself.
symptom is you require all of that extra.
Feeling
But how
emotionally
come
challenged by
people
new
laugh when
places.
you're making a joke about
Disliking words and
vegetarians
events that hurt animals
like
and people.
or something you've never heard of, you know?
Feeling a
That's what
sense of panic when faced
guess
with
I don't
anything
understand.
that requires a reasonable number of steps or amount of dexterity or know-how. Expecting that by acting a certain
to
way,
me, I'm like,
certain
well,
results
duh,
can
don't
be achieved,
laugh,
but
'cause I don't know
realizing and
about
dealing with emotions that those results don't always
anti-disestablishmentarianism
manifest.
or whatever, or
Feeling anxious at the thought of repairing, fixing, or locating
like I
something.
do get some jokes if it's a Minecraft joke,
Believing that everything has
but
a
usually
purpose.
it's a pun that I get quick.
Avoiding mundane tasks. Having a difficult time making or keeping friends. Feeling overwhelmed by something as simple as a trip to the grocery store. Having a tendency to overshare.
Oversharing.
Having a hard
So many
time finding
autistic
certain
people
objects in the
I
house,
talk to, I
but
talk
clearly
about how
knowing where other
oversharing really
objects are.
allowed me to.
Feeling anxious when unable to locate something, or when thinking about locating something. Object permanence challenges. lacking impulse control when speaking
Object
at a younger
permanence is
age,
when you can't see it, still remembering it's there, right?
perceiving situations and
I feel like I
conversations
struggle
as
with
black
that.
or white,
It's like, if I don't see it visually, my
monopolizing
brain will jump
conversations and
to
speaking exclusively about herself,
something.
overlooking or misunderstanding the middle spectrum of outcomes, events,
Gray
and
events.
emotions,
You
having
hear
an
that?
all or nothing
Understanding the
mentality,
middle spectrum of outcomes.
having
So, like,
difficulty
events.
recognizing how extreme
gray
emotions, outrage, deep love, will affect her, and being challenged to transfer what she has learned about emotions from one situation to the next. Overreacting. A small fight might signal the end of a relationship or collapse of the world. A small compliment might lead to a state of bliss.
Yeah.
Always trying
that
to communicate
overreacting?
correctly.
Yes.
Wanting to know
I mean,
word
it just makes me
origins
feel good.
and
If
or
a compliment
origins of
makes me
historical
feel
facts,
good,
root
how is
causes,
that
and foundations.
overreacting? Just because everybody else is too bitter and like
Having trouble identifying
to see
feelings
the
unless
make
they
'em
are extreme.
happy. Didn't know
Noticing
overreacting
patterns
could be
frequently.
with positive stuff.
More easily identifying personal feelings of anger, outrage, deep love,
How can
fear,
happiness be out of
giddiness, and
proportion?
anticipation than
I get
emotions of
negative
joy,
emotions, but,
satisfaction,
that
calmness, and
one's a weird one
serenity.
for me. If you're happy, you're happy.
Remembering things visually. Seeming to
if it
others to be
affects
narcissistic and controlling.
somebody else, like you get too happy.
Kraft also lists frequent co-occurring attributes, including obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, sensory issues, sight, sound, texture, smells, taste, synesthesia, generalized anxiety,
So,
feelings
like,
of polar
I have a hard
extremes,
time seeing
depressed,
how
overjoyed,
something can be out of proportion. I
inconsiderate,
get the
oversensitive,
negative, but only because
and
to me,
chronic
usually
fatigue
when
and
you
or
have negative
immune challenges.
reactions out of
And as we have
proportion,
seen, an
it
autistic
affects
person might
others.
be
So that's my
misdiagnosed as having a mental
rationale.
illness.
So that's why I'm like, well, can see.
Autism is thus a living, breathing group of attributes that gets missed as a diagnosis because it is broad, overlaps with many other traits, and is steeped in media-driven stereotypes.
Of it in that context.
Many women are thus self-diagnosed. For those who get a clinician's affirmation, many different diagnoses may have been considered, with autism as a kind of final question on the table.
Never a question.
Therefore, many women don't have an exhaustive understanding of themselves until later in their lives.
Yeah, I guess you...
Reaching for the stars.
You understood that
I've never been officially diagnosed. It's on my list of things to do. Sarah Seeger tells me. A planetary scientist and astrophysicist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Seeger searches for exoplanets, but has trouble with grocery shopping. Someone wrote an article about me strongly suggesting I had Asperger's, and then one of my mentors read it. His wife was one of the first doctors of autism, and he called me and told me his wife said that I was definitely on the autism spectrum. At first I said, no, I don't have that. And then I thought about it, and everything came together. When I was a child, other kids always thought I was odd. One of my friends who's definitely Asperger's never interacted with children when he was little. I wasn't as extreme as him, but before I found out I had Asperger's, I noticed he always made me laugh. One time, we were meeting for pizza, and I was 5 minutes late, and he's like, "What's the protocol if someone's late?" He honestly didn't know, and he had to have it all written down, like how many minutes to wait before it's rude to message them. So I watched him navigate the world, and it was really ironic that later I had it. Seeger has received a MacArthur Fellowship, a rare and prestigious prize awarded to a select few. She has been featured in books, talks, and academic panels, and at the time of our interview, she had just signed a 7-figure book deal. She tells me that many kids had crushes on her at school. That made her feel normal. But other than that, looking back, she felt very different until she arrived at MIT. Now she's in her element and describes a sense of belonging and fitting in. When I look back on my whole life, things just fit together. My sister told me my life was really rigid and scheduled. She laughs. If the schedule deviates from anything, I get really uncomfortable and my day will almost fall apart. She shares with me the confusion and frustration that ensue when a schedule changes, someone doesn't stick to a plan, or other unforeseen alterations occur. I resonate with her experience as I listen. Seeger's days are structured and busy. She's often at work by 6:30 or 7 a.m. and gets a whole day's work done on her own research in 2 hours.
You hear
Then
that?
she spends the rest of the
In
day
2
teaching
hours, she
classes or
gets a whole
attending
day's
meetings.
research
When she
done
gets home in the
at work.
afternoon, she walks the
Then she
dog
just
and makes calls to the West Coast.
gets to get
By
paid
5
to
p.m., she drives her kids to sports activities.
Sometimes I feel like that.
But it took her several years to streamline grocery shopping, something she
But
tells
see,
me
I
she
guess you
thinks she
have
finally
trouble
has a handle
knowing,
on.
okay, what next?
She used
it
to go
makes
to
you
the store and
anxious.
ask, "Where are the apples?" Although she thought she was using her normal voice, others would think she was being rude and abrupt and yelling at them. She says that people, her interface with the world, as she puts it, provide the most challenge. I have to slow down and make small talk first, she says.
Small talk is just
One time her neighbor even took time to explain to her how people warm up, slowly getting to the point, ask questions, and then gently move away. At the nearby dog park, Seeger can get annoyed when a fellow dog lover takes ages to get to the point of asking for a signature on a petition. She wants interactions to be clear, direct, and efficient. She shares the delight and curiosity that has come with figuring out things like the furnace in her house and detecting when it's about to break down by listening to the sound. But she has a persistent sense that things have been made more complex than necessary. I have found myself wondering the same, unsure why simple daily tasks are not more clearly taught or explained. Of her particular sensitivities, Seeger says, "I don't like being hugged or touched, even now. It feels like more of an awkwardness. I never cast it in terms of a sensitivity, but maybe it is." When she was little, her father, who was a doctor, thought she was mentally retarded, in her father's words, because she often stared off into space. I also cried for the first 2 years of my life, she tells me.
It's like, okay,
I didn't get a lot more information than that, and he's not alive now, so I can't probe him, but he thought something was wrong with me.
Oh, the Phillips head and the
Seeger
flathead
says that
thing.
at MIT
And
it seems like most people are somewhere on the spectrum.
Okay,
I feel at home there,
if it's something
and many people at
unfamiliar.
MIT say it's the first time they have had friends. People are okay with her straightforward style, which makes her life easier, as it takes away the barrier of having to cushion language with small talk. She can let her guard down at MIT, and many on her team are very Asperger's-y, as she puts it. People there tolerate her communication style well, but Seeger finds dealing with the outside, neurotypical world to be exhausting. It takes a huge amount of her emotional energy to think through everything before she speaks or acts. It's just tiring, she says.
Look,
Seeger relays to me her realizations about pacing in conversation, shooting the breeze, and other social formalities. Sometimes she waits patiently, while others take time to understand something, but to her it feels like watching moss grow. She'll often call her husband at work to see how he's doing, and then when she feels she's done, she'll suddenly say, "Okay, bye," and hang up. My husband used to call me a narcissist, she tells me. But when this whole Asperger's thing came about, he stopped.
did you hear that?
It helped us tremendously, because I think it helps him realize that when I'm being dismissive of something, it's not because I'm rude, it's just how I am. And it helps me realize that he's very sensitive, and I've got to be aware of it. Now that it's more of an open thing between us, it helps a great deal. Ultimately, Seeger says, being on the spectrum contributed to my success. She attributes much of that success to her not being bothered by the same superficial concerns as her peers when she was growing up.
it's related.
The life
I
of her
think
mind
narcissism should be
shielded
on
her
the
from the necessities of
autistic
small talk
spectrum.
and
It's not
inefficient
autism
social norms
because
that
they don't
require many
necessarily
adolescents to
have
sink time and
an
energy into
awareness.
fitting in. Now,
Because
as an adult, she has 2 children who deeply understand her and a loving relationship with her husband, and she loves her work. I always loved the stars and astronomy and thinking about what's
well,
out
that's what I'm
there,
saying. I feel like it
Seeger
starts
says.
with
I was good at
neurodivergency,
math and physics
not
and was able to
necessarily
put it all together.
autism,
I was lucky
but
I
some
was good
sort
at
of
something I loved.
neurodivergency mixed with trauma. That's why I feel like it
Synesthesia.
should be connected.
Synesthesia is a
Because who
well-documented
knows what
phenomenon of the
happens
brain,
on a
whereby
brain
an
level?
individual's
Like maybe
senses
they're
get crossed,
neurodivergent in the
such
trauma,
that hearing
like
sounds may
certain
elicit a
types of
visual
trauma
field of
brings it out.
colors, for example. A
Well,
particular
they
strand of
confuse
synesthesia is
narcissism and
called mirror
autism.
touch synesthesia.
No, it's
That is, a
not.
person can feel what another person
Like
feels by simply
doctors
observing what is
have a hard
happening to
time
the other
distinguishing
person.
between borderline narcissism and
The NPR
autism.
podcast Invisibilia documented one woman's experience with
I
synesthesia
think
and
maybe
described
just
in
because they're a
detail how
man, I
she
don't
had to
know. It'd
keep
be
herself
interesting to see
isolated because of the
people who are
severity of her trait.
misdiagnosed with narcissism and
One
eventually
time while in a grocery
diagnosed with
store, she
autism
fell
to see their
helplessly to the
sex.
ground when a little boy fell nearby.
Because women are
Other
misdiagnosed with
times, she
borderline a lot
becomes
of time
overwhelmed by the emotions of her
when
children
they're
or others in close
actually
proximity, which some
autistic.
therapists refer to as mirror emotion synesthesia. Synesthesia is the topic of many studies.
This is
A 2011
interesting.
study in the Journal of
The
Neuroscience
mirror.
in detail how she had to keep herself isolated because of the severity of her trait. One time while in a grocery store, she fell helplessly to the ground when a little boy fell nearby.
You hear that?
Other times, she
Her
becomes
mirror
overwhelmed by the emotions of her children or others in
synesthesia
close
or whatever
proximity,
was
which
so
some
bad
therapists
that a
refer to
little
as
boy fell
mirror
in the
emotion
grocery store and she
synesthesia.
fell. It's just
Synesthesia is the topic of many studies. A 2011 study in the Journal of Neuroscience
which
reported
basically
that
it's your senses
synesthetes were
cross.
superior
So
in
like I
facial
can see it
expression
visually. You see
recognition,
somebody
but not
fall,
facial identity
your
recognition.
body is like, you
The
know,
researchers concluded that
I can
mirror
see it
touch
being extreme.
synesthetes may possess enhanced emotion processing and call to attention the somatosensory system in the process of emotional empathy and perception of expression. A 2007 study in Nature Neuroscience found that participants reported a higher percentage of mirror touch errors as compared with control subjects. That is, synesthetes more often mistook perceived touch for actual touch because they feel the same to them. And a
It's cold.
2013 study in the journal Emotion reported that mirror touch synesthetes had a heightened and accurate recognition response to the emotion of fear, but not to those of happiness or disgust. Like Elaine
See,
Aron's
that was
characterization of
interesting to me.
HSP as an evolutionary survival strategy, the researchers
She
concluded that
said,
relying on somatosensory
let's do it.
mechanisms would more often mistook perceived touch for actual touch because they feel the same to them. And a 2013 study in the journal Emotion reported that mirror touch synesthetes had a heightened and accurate recognition response to the emotion of fear, but not to those of happiness or disgust.
You hear that? Think about me. Think about how I'm so sensitive to people's stress, even when they're like not really, like they might be slightly stressed, but then I jump to, oh my God, like my anxiety and stuff fills it into their stressed about me. But I have a harder time, I guess, telling when people are happy. Because unless they're like, because the slightest bit of stress I can detect. And, you know, then my anxiety fills it in. But it's like my mom, I realized she will be fine, but just slightly stressed. And then they said they can't detect or share the same responses to disgust as other people. Basically, it's like they worded it like they have a abnormal, like, response, under a response to disgust. You know how, like, the chair thing when I was little and, like, other weird stuff that don't gross me out that normally would. It's like I've always wondered if, even before I found this out, if I had some sort of weird thing with this, because I don't get grossed out, which leads me with it's bad with my cleaning habits. Because the things that would normally cause someone to be like, okay, I need to clean, I'm like, so I don't know what that has to do with synesthesia. I didn't know synesthesia was this involved. I thought it was like, okay, you see sound, um, but there is basically any incoming sensory input can cause like reactions to like varied reactions. I think I'm
Like
a
Elaine
big
Aron's
synesthesia
characterization of
person because I
HSP as an
know moving
evolutionary
stuff
survival strategy,
to
the
me makes
researchers
a very
concluded that
distinct
relying on
sound,
somatosensory
and
mechanisms would be evolutionarily adaptive,
movement
explaining
or
the existence and persistence of mirror
the
touch
emotional thing you
synesthesia
were
in
talking
humans.
about.
C.C.
I
Hart,
think like
the synesthete we met
an
earlier,
empath might
told
be
me that
plugged
when
into
she was a
this.
kid, she could tell you what page a certain scene was on because all the pages had corresponding colors.
See, we're
This was
talking
an
about
experience she had
being
known her
able to
whole
tell
life but
you
lacked a name for.
all the scenes
Finding out
that
there was a
something
name for
specific
her
was on because
experience
each
and that others
specific
in the
scene
world
had a
shared
different
it
color and her
gave
brain
her a
remembered
feeling
the
of
colors.
community and
So I
connection.
wonder if like
So much opened up, and it was a
it's
huge
cool.
sense of relief in recognizing that there were communities of people like me.
I need to
The sense
read
that
about
others have had the same
synesthesia.
experiences helped me recalibrate what it
I never
means to
thought
be a
knew it was so
neurodivergent individual.
vast.
She is now a board member of the International Association of Synesthetes, Artists, and Scientists, IASAS. Digging deeper, parsing out. Many people relate to the experience of sensing others, emotions, and the environment around them. In fact, many of us simply take this to be a natural part of who we are. Now studies on mirror neurons, empathy, and neurodivergence support the experience and give it a much-needed lens inside of academia. This sensitivity is also shown in animal species such as monkeys, birds, rodents, and fish. Studies describe select members of a species displaying increased responsivity, flexibility, and plasticity, indicating an evolutionary advantage. In more recent years, this field has come to be known as sensory biology, with dedicated researchers at Johns Hopkins,
I didn't know
Duke,
they had a
the University of California campuses, and elsewhere,
sensory
and has
biology.
maintained a focus on animals.
So biology is now.
But what does this all
has a
mean in human
branch
terms?
about
That's where
studying
mirror
senses
neurons
and
come in.
neurodivergency.
In
So
his
that's
book,
big.
Mirroring People, The New Science of How We Connect with Others, Marco Iacoboni writes, the human brain contains about 100 billion neurons, each of which can make contact with thousands, even tens of thousands of other neurons. These contacts, or synapses, are the means by which neurons communicate with one another, and their number is staggering. Iacoboni was a student of
So it
Giacomo
makes sense
Rizzolatti,
with what he said.
the Ukrainian scientist who
that
first discovered
the
mirror
mirror
neurons while
neurons,
studying
how many
monkeys
we
in his
have,
laboratory
and
in
talking about
Italy.
each of those neurons in our
Rizzolatti's lab
brain.
focused on the
Like just a
neocortex,
neuron
specifically
can
a
connect
region
to
of the
like
neocortex
thousands or
labeled
however many
F5
other
that is
neurons.
responsible for
So it makes
planning,
sense with
selecting,
pervasive
and executing
developmental disorder
actions.
why it's a spectrum.
The story
Because
goes
there's no
that
one
as a
way that
scientist reached for
it
something,
happens.
a burst of activity was recorded coming from an observing monkey's brain, even though the monkey didn't move or copy the scientist's gesture. This happened several times. Neither they nor any neuroscientists in the world could have imagined that motor cells could fire merely at the perception of somebody else's
Oh, you
actions,
hear that? They did a
with no
study on
motor action
monkeys,
involved at
and
all.
the monkey,
Iacoboni writes, cells
they
in the
did
monkey
something,
brain
and
that
his
send
motor
signals to other
neurons
cells that
fired,
are
and he didn't
anatomically
move,
connected to muscles
and they
have
didn't
no
know
business
that could be
firing when the
possible.
monkey is completely still, hands in lap, watching somebody else's actions, and yet they did. At the time, neuroscientists believed that specific functions controlled by the brain were limited to specific boxes. In line with earlier mechanistic thinking that has shaped the study of the brain, such a belief makes sense. As Iacoboni explains it, Neuroscientists have tended to think of perception, cognition, and action as distinct spheres. But to begin to entertain the possibility that there is crossover and more complexity is exciting. Further experiments found that close proximity also determined a mirror response, and that simulations would not elicit it. The objects or people executing an action had to be real, not robots or graphics, in order to elicit a mirror
Can you
response.
hear that?
The tactile receptive field and the visual receptive field were found to be related in the brain. A new idea was thus born within neuroscience,
Okay.
whereby some researchers concluded that the brain was attempting to
Okay,
create a
baby.
map that took into consideration the visual
gonna go
and
poop?
tactile space surrounding the body, and that accounted for potential actions within that space. This discovery and the evolution of our understanding of mirror neurons
Okay, baby.
is important to
Just
situating a
don't stay in there too
neurodiversity
long.
framework
Playing on the
within
Switch
modern life.
only. Make sure you're trying to poop.
The research scientists in Italy were intrigued and perplexed
'Cause it's
and
still
looked to
quiet
earlier
playtime.
philosophical explanations of human behavior, action, empathy, and learning. Rizzolatti and his colleagues departed from much of the history of the science of the brain, venturing out and becoming known for their range of insight and inquiry. This way of thinking could prime the
See, I think
psychological
it's another
sciences
reason
for
why
how to think about
autism is,
neurodiversity, given
forming
its
because
natural
it's the
focus on variety,
nature of
as
it. You
opposed
have
to a mechanistic or reductionist,
So, like,
disease-based
it
model of
takes a
mental
very
differences.
self-aware person to really
The synthesizing
together.
synesthete.
Because they were just talking about how
Harvard
that
neurologist
person
Joel
provided, like,
Salinas
really
has
good insight.
synesthesia and documents the
And with
overlap with
most
other
other
traits such as
science
autism in his
sciences, when it's
2017
studying
book,
people,
Mirror
they
Touch,
hold
a
on, baby.
memoir
They
of
go try to
synesthesia
poop.
and the secret life of the
Huh?
brain. Salinas confirmed to me the unique interplay between genes, biology,
With
and
other
experience that gives rise to
sciences where
such
they're studying
overlapping
the
sensitive
brain,
traits or diagnoses.
like, if they were
People on the
studying
autism spectrum
schizophrenia,
are
if they were
much more likely to
studying
have
like
synesthesia compared to the general
bipolar, they
population,
wouldn't
he says.
necessarily need the
Studies confirm
insight
this as
as much
well.
as neurodivergency.
Could you call somebody with synesthesia
It's the
autistic?
brain, so they
He
think
asks
is
rhetorically as
essentially
we
the
speak.
same.
That ends up being more a matter of semantics and technicalities because these are all concepts. What we're trying to describe when we talk about synesthesia is a sensory experience. So, someone who has synesthesia may also fall in the definition of the autism spectrum, but someone with synesthesia may not necessarily meet the checkboxes or criteria to be defined as someone on the autism spectrum. I find Salinas's technical prowess reassuring while talking to him, as his nuanced understandings and insights surpass those of most psychologists and psychiatrists. A behavioral neurologist, he studies the dynamic relationship between social relationships, genes, and neurological traits. Many of the genes that have been identified to be linked to synesthesia have overlap in the genes that have been identified as strong candidates or likely involved in the autism spectrum. He tells me. Differences in brain connectivity are found in both autistic people and synesthetes, explaining why both groups experience similar sensations. An additional finding is that the way autistic people describe their experiences of sensation and sensory differences overlaps with the descriptions of people who have synesthesia. For instance, Cece Hart says, "I wear headphones on the train, the same ones that DJs wear to block out sound. I have trouble filtering out ambient sound from the sound I might be focusing on, like the people sitting next to me. Sounds also have colors or feelings in my body, and I feel like I'm getting battered when I'm in a really sensory-rich environment." This way of describing her sensory environment is almost identical to the way many autistic women describe their lives. Learning about synesthesia was a gateway to recognizing the issues I've always had with processing sensory feedback, especially tactile and auditory. Hart says, "I've got a low level of olfactory tolerance when things smell really strong. My tolerance for crowds is low, my tolerance for aromas is low, and my tolerance for sound is low, and I take it in bits and pieces." Salinas's perspective as a medical professional, who is also a synesthete, provides fascinating insight as well. I reached out to him after reading his book, and he flew to San Francisco from Boston to do an event with the Neurodiversity Project, the community forum I host for authors exploring innovative research and solutions in medicine and society. An extremely articulate and eloquent individual, he quickly earned my respect for both his warm manner and sharp scientific insight. Growing up in Miami with a short stint in Nicaragua, Salinas experienced sensations intensely and never had a name for the colors and empathy that filled his daily life.
It's funny.
While in
I didn't
India
know
on a
empathy
medical
was
school
tied
trip,
into
someone
synesthesia,
mentioned
like,
synesthesia,
but I
and finally
definitely,
everything clicked
you
for
know,
him. In his book, he details what it's like to perform surgery or give a hug or treat a psychiatric patient as a synesthete.
Oh God, yeah.
Suffice to say, he feels everything intensely, so he has had to both embrace and manage the experience. Feeling profound empathy and feeling overwhelmed are both part of the picture for him,
My play.
and he has expertly learned to set appropriate boundaries for himself and others. In my opinion, part of what makes him such a popular neurologist at Harvard and Massachusetts General Hospital is that he embodies the neurodiversity framework as he relates to his fellow neurodivergent patients. He understands and embraces difference, feels no need to pathologize, and seeks to treat people only when they express distress and a desire for treatment. Is synesthesia a gift, a curse, or none of the above? Salinas asked at a recent conference. And he tells me that the same could be asked not only of the autism spectrum, synesthesia, or other traits, but of brains in general. Is having your brain a gift, a curse, or none of the above? He reiterates. Context is key, he says, because in one situation, one set of traits can be highly beneficial, and in another situation, those same traits can be crippling. As an example, he tells me about a woman who has obsessive-compulsive disorder, as defined in the DSM. She is highly obsessive and can barely function in situations where she has to make quick decisions. But she is a genius in the operating room, where she is a scrub tech. So she is the one organizing the instruments for surgeons at exactly the right time.
You hear that?
She is
From a
very
woman with
meticulous,
OCD
partly because
who's
of how her
crippled
brain is
by
wired and programmed. So, what would be an impediment in some situations is an advantage in the
She's like a
operating room.
top-notch
So it
surgical
really comes
tech
down to
because
context, he
of
says,
her
which is
OCD.
why the DSM and
She
those
has
definitions
textbook
need to be
OCD references as well
contextualized.
to why she
The
believes
function of
she's
the DSM is to give a name when someone is not doing well, meaning they're having trouble
God, I can't
functioning with
hear.
their occupation or
It's like
socially.
so loud.
Basically, they're in distress in one way or another. And it's the patient relating that they are in distress, not a family member who is in distress over the other person's behavior. The clinician's responsibility is to dig deep down and determine whether the environment is the problem or whether something is happening with the brain and body. That's the goal of medicine, or should be, Salinas says. My sense is not to use the DSM as a means to label people, because that can lead to all sorts of alienation and loneliness, and that in turn can create problems. But to use the DSM as a way of helping the person in distress. Some people benefit from having a label, but not everybody does. He tells me about one patient who had a number of cognitive symptoms of depression, and when he explained that to her, she began to cry because she was so grateful to have a name for her experience. It's in those situations that the DSM can be useful, but when the DSM is used to stigmatize or its categories are imposed upon someone, I think that's when it can be problematic. Salinas thinks the DSM is a broad and primitive tool used to understand the brain and believes a much better understanding of the brain will come from focusing on the interplay between biology and environment. I think psychiatry is moving there, he says, which means it's also moving closer toward neurology. People are moving away from checkboxes of
I
observations
guess
and instead
psychology and
focusing on
neurology
patterns
really
of
should be
physiology.
one study
For
side by
example, the
side.
brain tends to react this way or that way in such and such a context. Or your brain appears X or Y way, or your brain connectivity looks like A or B, or you have this collection of genes.
They're saying that
I
psychology.
think that will lead to better insights about
saying
what
that
the underlying
you
cause
need to
is.
understand the
And the more
biology
specific you get about what the underlying cause is,
people
then the more
who join
specific
it
you can
with
get about
psychology,
treatments for
and it's
people who
moving
are
towards
in distress.
Like psychology's moving towards
Since Salinas is a behavioral neurologist, one of his goals is to figure out what his clients are communicating. We're all living in these bodies that we're born with, outside of our own choice, and our bodies come with all sorts of weird things, and our brain is locked in this dark tomb, and there's no way to really know what another person is experiencing. Language is our primary communication tool, which of course has limitations. So, trying to tease apart in as granular a way as possible what someone is trying to communicate, I find that extremely helpful. The third factor, ADHD. The co-occurrence of autism and synesthesia is well documented, but the sensitivities found within autism and ADHD are even more well known. For autistics, sensory sensitivities often dictate the development of particular behaviors. Stimming refers to movements, such as flapping the hands or tapping the fingers, that help relieve anxiety that comes with overstimulation. It can also take the form of mental stimming, such as repeating numbers, words, or letters, also referred to as echolalia. When I was a child, for instance, I had a mental count of the electrical poles on my street, and every time we drove by, I had to mark in my mind the midpoint between each.
Talk about unique schooling. This person is a mom. She's unschooling. She's an unschooling mama of 3 in an RV. And I thought about how cool that life would be if you didn't. Her husband's a traveling medical somebody, a traveling medical worker. So they just got an RV for the husband, and the whole family just travels with the husband, and any place they stop, they, it's an everlasting field trip essentially to see, like, I think that would be so cool. I really think that if you were able to meet their social needs, you could, and you were you could either hire somebody to do like the stuff you couldn't teach, like school wouldn't be necessary. Seeing how if you're neurodivergent and the one way thing is harmful. But I'm so glad that the schools are moving away from. I can't believe she said it's taken them so long to even with the diagnosis to do what they needed to do to help her son. I know it was bad, but he's finished.
You finished pooping?
All right, Xander.
Whole. With ADHD, the sensitivity shows up differently. High stimulation is both exciting and confusing for people with ADHD because they can get overwhelmed and overstimulated easily without realizing they are approaching that point. Along with sensory regulation, emotional regulation becomes difficult, which accounts for some of the sensory overload or meltdowns common in ADHD, as with the autist. There is a shared experience across both neurodivergences of gradual sensory overwhelm and then having to recover. A 2006 report from the National Autistic Society indicates that autistics have a lower threshold for audio, visual, oral, and touch stimuli. Such abnormalities were found to decrease over time, except for touch sensitivity. A 2014 study in the American Journal of Psychiatry documents the emotional dysregulation that occurs for 30 to 70% of people with ADHD, making emotional sensitivity a higher level of concern than generally considered for this population. Sensitivity is core to both of these neurodivergences and gets masked by the use of words such as dysregulation, abnormality, and dysfunction. ADHD is commonly thought of as something that makes little boys fidgety, distracted, and unable to stay still. Doctors and researchers often give little attention to what is happening under the surface and in the broader environment. And, of course, there is very little focus on girls and women. As in the case of autism, our outdated stereotypes are based largely on an initial excitement and eagerness in the medical community to capture and frame a so-called new set of behaviors that started surfacing. And because so many girls and women with ADHD are smart and have done well in school, they've flown under the diagnostic and research radars. Women with ADHD who have struggled for years with logistical challenges often develop a nagging sense of not being good enough, never being able to hit the mark at work or home, and they struggle with anxiety and depression. But many women with ADHD also use their gift for hyperfocusing to excel beyond their peers in writing, research, art, and other areas. Remember, despite what the words attention deficit imply, ADHD is not a deficit of attention, but rather a challenge of regulating it at will or on demand. People with ADHD often have too much attention, just not at the socially acceptable times or situations found in our highly regimented and structured societies. Sensitivity among people with ADHD is fascinating, important, and markedly different from that seen in HSP or autism. I think of sensitivity within ADHD as having two parts. First, there is a deep curiosity about and sensitivity to new information and stimuli, an experience not too different from that of a bee driven to discover all available pollen. Second, there is the sensitivity that results from being ADHD, especially if it's been unknown, where people become sensitive to criticism and being judged. It's hard to do well at some times, and then at other times feel like a total failure for being late, missing an appointment, missing a deadline, getting dates or times confused, or other results of having a challenged prefrontal cortex and struggling executive functioning. There is also a sensitivity to ourselves, our own emotions, regulating those emotions, and not being so hard on ourselves. It's no surprise, then, that it is not uncommon for adults with ADHD to have meltdowns or blow-ups, like an adult tantrum. The sensory overload gets to be too much when someone is trying to hold together multiple threads of information or expectations in a neurotypical context. I have struggled since I was a child with these meltdowns, but had no clue what they were. I would feel very sensitive to being judged or criticized, and then find myself experiencing sudden bouts of anger or frustration. Much of the experience is a kind of accumulated trauma. After repeated attempts to do things the right way and not being able to finally get it, the person with ADHD eventually boils over with frustration. And other people are surprised or confused because everything that's happening is invisible and under the surface. It's a struggle that many people deal with for years before they discover what's really going on. Higher education.
And I will give you some.
I probably lasted about 3 months into my postdoc before I couldn't focus anymore, and it felt like I wasn't present throughout the week. My friend Stephanie tells me one day about her undiagnosed ADHD.
If you want
I would go
I'll give you
home
your
mentally and
pencil.
emotionally exhausted and spent most of my days off just
I want to
spaced
start
out.
making you write before you get
Then
your
on the
tablet.
weekends,
If you
I would
don't
have 2
do
days
it
to
by
myself,
choice.
but I was just exhausted and things became even more difficult.
You always
Time
say
was
you'll do it
flying,
later, babe.
and I
I'm
was
just letting you know
accomplishing
that.
absolutely nothing.
Later never seems to
In grad
come.
school, there was structure and variation in the tasks, and it wasn't so much sitting at one table working on one computer doing the same thing over and over. I was dreading the end of school for that
Yeah.
reason.
I can't. Is that loud? I can't tell how loud that is because of my ear. It's on 11.
Stop it.
I want it at the Wendy Zombie where it at for my walk. Oh, I don't know. And did it. Wow!
What is it?
Look, my Wendy Zombie where it at. A Wendy Zombie all of you. What? What? One. Everything diamond,
And what kind of TNT?
diamond.
What does that do?
Diamond.
It turns everything to diamonds.